Yes, good afternoon, and thank you to the members of the California Reparations Task Force, fellow genealogists, and attendees at today's meeting. I'm honored to participate in the discussion connected with this important legislation. Determining who belongs to the community of eligibility is at the root of today's discussion. My personal journey reflects and supports that African Americans can document their connections to enslaved ancestors. Next slide, please. I trace my maternal ancestry to enslaved matriarch Florianne, whose daughters Rose and Marianne Reynolds emerged in Norfolk, Virginia court records in 1825 after Rose paid $500 to free her younger sister from a slave trading family. I trace my enslaved paternal ancestry to Civil War veteran Corporal Fielding Lyle of Company B of the 114th Regiment of U.S. Colored Troops, who used his $200 military bounty in 1874 to buy 20 acres of land. Those acres formed the nucleus of a town that still stands today called Lyletown, named after its founder and located in Clark County, Kentucky. Next slide, please. And finally, I trace my maternal enslaved ancestry to Rachel Hodges of Portsmouth, Virginia, a woman sold away from her family in the 1850s. A woman whose son, Mills Sumner Jr., found his mother in Atlanta, Georgia, after a 26-year search. It required the same number of years to research these ancestors, to reunite mother and son visually with photographs, because different elders held different heirlooms, and each only knew small parts of our family's history. I offer these stories to exemplify the types of discoveries possible through research. The first example, historian Dr. Tommy Bosier's study, Free Blacks in Norfolk, traced the history of free African American Helen Robinson Harris to enslaved ancestors, Florianne, Rose, and Marianne Reynolds. The second example, historian Harry G. Enoch's 2011 Winchester Sun newspaper article, Where in the World, Lyletown, a Black Hamlet, combine private court and public records to document the founding of a community by a formerly enslaved man. And the last example of Rachel Hodges and Mills Sumner Jr. showed how piecing together different sources, oral history, family heirlooms, and public records, such as the Atlanta, Georgia Freedmen's Savings Bank account record, can flesh out stories and connect African Americans to their enslaved ancestry. Next slide, please. My genealogy journey began during the U.S. bicentennial in 1976 in the halls of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. when I was 13 years old. There I met James Walker, a founder of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. He helped me navigate through archival records and sources. I also later met Reginald Washington, Walker's successor, who developed research guides and programs on African American genealogy. Through these two men and other archive staff, I witnessed the valuable work being done by the National Archives to increase access to federal records and assist with African American genealogy and enslaved family research. Next slide, please. After college, I worked in special libraries, which led to my position as a professional genealogist at a premier U.S. lineage society, Daughters of the American Revolution. While there, I reviewed, approved, or rejected several thousand applications of women who traced their lineage to Revolutionary War patriots. I contributed research to two books, Forgotten Patriots and Women of the Revolutionary Era, publications that identified thousands of sources documenting African Americans, Native Americans, and women who supported the American cause during the war. I also helped document that Eunice Russ Ames, Amos Davis, the daughter of Patriot Prince Ames and the granddaughter of an enslaved man, joined the Lineage Society in 1896, more than 80 years prior to the date when the members believed the first African American woman joined their Lineage Society. My years at the DAR exposed me to an array of genealogical sources, publications, and institutions that documented African American lives dating before America's founding. I discovered published sources with segregated information, and by this I mean records where African Americans and people of color were listed separately from whites. I realized, ironically, that some of those biased record-keeping and publishing practices help current genealogists identify African American ancestors more readily. I shared this part of my journey to further emphasize that enslaved Africans, African Americans, Native Americans, and others appear in multiple types of sources and records as enslaved people. And that evidence needed to trace enslaved ancestry exists in abundance in primary, secondary, and derivative sources. Next slide, please. My genealogy journey carried me to my current position at the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives branch at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where I serve as a genealogy specialist, providing genealogical and historical reference assistance to museum staff and the public. Next slide, please. I also support the museum's, one slide back, please. There. I also support the museum's crowdsourcing project, where volunteers help us transcribe 1.7 million images of the Freedmen's Bureau digital records collection. Our goal is to provide genealogists, historians, and other researchers with full text searchable, free online access to the records. To date, more than 37,000 volunteers have helped us transcribe more than 340,000 of the 1.7 million digital images. The Freedmen's Bureau records provide information crucial to documenting pivotal generations of African Americans between enslavement and freedom. Created in 1865 by Congress to manage abandoned lands, help white refugees, and assist the formerly enslaved, Bureau operations extended across 15 states, Western territories, and Washington, D.C. Bureau agents recorded incomparable details about African American individuals and families, and it is this body of records that will assist some of the potential members of the community of eligibility in tracing their lineage to enslaved ancestors. Next slide, please. I've highlighted the positive experiences connected with enslaved family research. However, there are negatives. Genealogical research is a time-consuming, costly process. Slave-era research is challenging because the system varied over time, by place, and by the form of slavery practice, and by the manner in which the records documented enslavement. I generalized the types of records I used to document my enslaved ancestry. Those records were scattered across a multitude of research institutions across the nation. Looking at California.
Ms. Gentry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. You have about 1 minute. 1 minute warning.
Okay, I'm closing. Looking at California genealogical and historical resources and the possible places of enslavement of the ancestors of the community of eligibility, I have drafted a short list of suggestions to consider as you continue meetings, debates, and discussions beyond today's gathering. Time limits prevent me from reading the suggestions. This concludes my remarks, and I have submitted the list of suggestions in writing for the record. If members of the task force have any questions, I'm happy to address them.